Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling Brown v. Board of Education.
Ooh.
One of those cases.
Big one.
Yeah, one of those cases that, everyone kind of knows the name of.
Right.
But maybe not all the details.
Definitely.
And it's so relevant even today.
Absolutely.
So you've sent over articles, analyses, even a whole other podcast episode.
Wow.
So we've got a lot to dig into.
Yeah, we've got a real buffet of information here.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
So I guess maybe you could start us off by, setting the stage,
Okay.
before we even get to 1954 and the case itself.
Sure.
What was life like for Black Americans in the decades leading up to this?
Well, imagine it's the early 20th century,
Okay.
And you're a Black student, and this idea of separate but equal is just the reality.
Right, from Plessy v. Ferguson.
Exactly. Plessy v. Ferguson back in 1896 kind of cemented that as the law of the land,
Right,
but
yeah.
equal.
Yeah, right.
It was anything but. I mean,
Yeah.
schools, restrooms, even drinking fountains. Separate and totally inferior if you weren't white.
So it's like the system itself was designed
To keep people separate and unequal.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the NAACP was working on this for decades, right? Like really laying the groundwork legally for what would become this case.
They were so strategic.
Yeah.
They knew they needed airtight legal arguments, compelling evidence. It wasn't just about lawyers either.
Right.
They brought in social scientists like Kenneth and Mamie Clark, these incredible researchers.
Yeah.
They designed what's become known as the doll test.
Wait, hold on. The doll test.
Yes.
Like that was part of this case?
It was a key part of the case.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so they showed Black children dolls of different races
Good.
and asked them questions like, which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll?
Oh, gosh.
And the results,
I can imagine.
heartbreaking.
Yeah.
These children as young as 3 were already internalizing the racism they faced.
Like-
They often labeled the white dolls as good and the Black dolls as bad.
That's just
It's
so powerful, though.
It really showed the psychological impact of segregation on these kids.
Right.
And the NAACP used that research to argue that separate was inherently unequal.
Wow. So it wasn't just like a legal argument. It was
It brought in the science.
the human impact.
The human impact, exactly.
And all of this culminates in 1954 with Brown v. Board,
Yes, the big one.
and the Supreme Court declares segregation in public schools unconstitutional unanimously.
Unanimously, which is huge.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
This wasn't just a shift. It was like an earthquake in American law and society.
So what was the reaction like?
Well, you'd think everyone just started integrating immediately.
Right.
But no.
Oh.
There's this phrase in the Brown ruling, all deliberate speed.
Okay.
The court said schools should desegregate with all deliberate speed.
Sounds reasonable.
Right. But historian Michael J. Klarman, he makes this really chilling argument. He says that phrase, all deliberate speed, it was basically a loophole.
A loophole?
Loophole for southern states
Wow.
to delay integration.
Also, it was almost like an invitation to just drag their feet.
But they saw it as an invitation to drag their feet and delay as long as possible.
So Brown was this massive win legally,
Absolutely.
but the devil was in the details.
You got it.
And those details were being very fiercely debated.
Oh, yeah. And imagine you're in the South at this time.
Yeah.
News of Brown spreads, and there's this sense of almost terror for some people.
Really?
Not of integration itself, but of the backlash.
Right.
That's when you see these white citizens councils popping up all over.
Okay, so these were groups dedicated to preserving segregation.
Basically.
But weren't they like basically the KKK in suits?
Well, it's tempting to simplify it like that,
Okay.
but they were more insidious in a way. These were doctors, lawyers, business owners, your average, quote-unquote, respectable white folks.
Yeah.
Fighting to uphold a racist system.
And they had a lot of members.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Tons. By 1956, they had 250,000 members.
250,000.
250,000.
That's wild.
Yeah. And of course, there was actual violence, too.
Right.
Tragically.
Yeah.
The KKK saw a resurgence using terror tactics like bombings and lynchings to intimidate Black communities and anyone who supported integration.
And it wasn't just, like the KKK.
Right.
You had politicians openly defying the court.
Absolutely. You had figures like Senator James Eastland vowing to defy the Supreme Court, using their power to obstruct integration at every turn.
So it's like you have this legal victory,
Mm-hmm.
but it's playing out in a society that is deeply resistant to change.
Absolutely.
Were there any places where integration went smoothly?
You know, what's interesting is the South wasn't a monolith in its response.
Okay.
Places like Washington, D.C. and some border states, they actually desegregated relatively quickly.
Really?
Yeah. Something like 70% of those school districts integrated within a year.
Wow, that's amazing.
But then you have the Deep South,
Right.
Alabama, Mississippi,
Yeah.
places where resistance was fierce and they got creative.
Okay.
They manipulated entry requirements,
Mm-hmm.
closed public schools, even funneled money into private all-white academies to just completely circumvent Brown.
It's like a whole playbook of just obstruction.
Totally.
Wasn't there one really infamous example of this resistance?
Oh, you mean Virginia?
Yeah, like massive resistance or
A
something?
massive resistance, yeah.
Yeah.
Led by Senator Harry F. Byrd, they launched this campaign called Massive Resistance.
Wow.
They actually closed schools rather than integrate.
Oh my gosh.
And then they used taxpayer money to fund those private segregated schools we talked about.
So Brown sparks this legal battle,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really a battle for like the soul of the nation, right?
You got it.
Like what kind of country America wants to be.
Exactly what it was.
Yeah. And even with all this resistance, Brown lit a fire in the Black community.
It did.
It was like a validation
Mm-hmm.
that change was possible.
Yeah, you see figures like Rosa Parks just a year after Brown refusing to give up her seat on that Montgomery bus.
Powerful.
Right. And she later talked about how Brown gave her this wave of hope,
Wow.
this feeling that people could demand their rights.
So Brown was more than just a ruling.
Absolutely.
It was like a catalyst for the civil rights movement.
Yes, it gave activists this powerful legal weapon and a rallying cry.
Right. And you see figures like Martin Luther King Jr. rising to prominence.
Exactly.
Groups like core SCLC gaining momentum.
It's like Brown had this ripple effect throughout the movement.
And it's important to note that historians don't all agree on Brown's impact.
No, of course not. History is messy.
Yeah.
You've got some historians like Richard Kluger who focus on the legal triumph of Brown.
Okay.
They see it as this turning point paving the way for federal intervention in civil rights.
So for them, it's all about the precedent that Brown set.
Exactly.
Like he was the key that unlocked all these other things.
Right. And then you have revisionists like Michael J. Klarman, who we've already talked about.
Yeah.
They're more critical. They emphasize the limited practical impact because of all that resistance.
Yeah. They're saying it was important symbolically, but not necessarily in practice.
They point to the slow pace of desegregation,
Right.
the persistent inequalities, and the fact that many of the problems Brown aimed to address are still with us today.
Right. It wasn't a cure-all.
Right.
And then there's the traditionalist view, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like C. Van Woodward, who really highlight how deep that Southern resistance was.
They're really focused on that context.
Yeah.
The fact that white supremacy was so deeply embedded in the South.
Right.
And people went to extraordinary lengths to preserve segregation.
It's like they're saying Brown exposed the limits of legal change
Exactly.
when you're up against such entrenched social and cultural norms.
Exactly. And then there's this other group of historians that I think is really important.
Okay.
The social historians, like Charles M. Payne.
Yeah.
They shift the focus to the grassroots activism.
So these are the people on the ground.
Exactly. The community organizers, the everyday people fighting for change in their schools, their neighborhoods.
Yeah.
They took Brown and ran with it.
They weren't waiting for someone to tell them what to do.
Exactly. They were organizing, protesting, pushing for change on a local level.
So for them, Brown is more than just a Supreme Court decision.
Right.
It's like the spark.
It's a catalyst for a whole movement.
Exactly. And they argue that without these activists, Brown might have remained a symbolic victory.
So we've got this huge legal win. It sets off this chain reaction, both good and bad.
Yeah.
It's clear that this case is more than just a history lesson.
Definitely.
It's got layers, it's complex, and it feels incredibly relevant even today.
Absolutely.
But I think we need to take a breath.
Yeah.
And process all of this.
Let's do it.
Before we jump into part 2.
Agreed.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
but there's still so much to unpack.
Totally.
I'm already looking forward to diving deeper into Brown's legacy and what it means for us today.
Me too. We'll be right back after a short break. Okay, so we're back, and I'm still thinking about, that first part, like Brown v. Board, this case about schools. It's
so much bigger than school.
it's like you pull on this one thread, and this whole tapestry of American history unravels.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, its impact went way beyond
absolutely.
just those classroom doors.
It really did. It affected housing, voting, even swimming pools, believe it or not.
Swimming pools. Seriously.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Before Brown, separate but equal was the norm.
Right.
So you had separate pools for Black people and white people. And guess which ones were usually cleaner, better maintained?
Yeah.
That's
it's like, how did people not see
I know
how inherently unequal that was?
I think that's the point, though, right? Segregation was so ingrained in society, it was just the air people breathed.
Yeah.
And Brown helped clear the air, so to speak.
Okay.
The legal principles from the case weren't limited to schools.
Right.
Civil rights lawyers used Brown to challenge segregation in all sorts of public spaces.
Or
parks, buses, even those swimming pools.
It's like Brown gave them a legal battering ram.
Exactly. A tool to start breaking down these walls.
So it was a blueprint for dismantling segregation.
Mm-hmm.
But it definitely wasn't a quick fix.
No change takes time, especially when you're dealing with centuries of deeply entrenched racism and inequality.
But at least Brown gave the civil rights movement a foundation.
Absolutely. It gave them a legal and moral foundation to build on.
And eventually it led to those huge legislative wins, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, those were massive.
It's huge. Those acts outlawed discrimination in pretty much every area of life, voting, employment, housing, you name it.
And Brown was like a stepping stone.
Totally. A key stepping stone to those landmark pieces of legislation.
So if Brown was so transformative, why does it feel like we're still dealing with so many of the same issues today?
Right.
Like racial disparities in education and housing and wealth, they're still very real.
That's the complicated truth about Brown's legacy.
Yeah.
It was a victory. Don't get me wrong. It was crucial.
Right.
But it wasn't a magic wand.
Right.
It didn't magically erase racism or level the playing field.
So are we saying that Brown's promise was like unfulfilled?
I wouldn't say unfulfilled. It's more like Brown cracked open the door to equality.
Okay.
But it didn't swing it wide open, and it certainly didn't guarantee that everyone could walk through that door freely.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Like, we can celebrate the achievements of Brown.
Absolutely.
But also acknowledge that there's still so much work to do.
So much work to do. Exactly. Take education, for example.
Okay.
We've legally desegregated schools.
Right.
But in a lot of communities, you still see de facto segregation.
Right.
Schools that are predominantly Black or predominantly white just because of housing patterns and socioeconomic factors.
It's like this tangled web.
It is.
Of issues.
It's really complex.
And there's the achievement gap.
Right.
Like, Black students and white students still perform differently on standardized tests. Graduation rates are different. It's
still there.
It's complicated, but it's there.
And that gap is about more than just the schools themselves.
Right.
It's about historical disadvantages, unequal access to resources, implicit bias, a whole system that needs to be addressed.
So it's like Brown gave us the legal tools, but actually building a truly equitable society, that's a whole other project.
It is a whole other project, and it's one that we're still working on.
And that project requires more than just laws, right?
Oh, for sure. We need to tackle the systemic issues that create these inequalities.
Like what kinds of things?
Things like housing discrimination, redlining the racial wealth gap, all that stuff is connected.
So it's all interconnected.
Totally.
Brown was powerful. But just the first step.
The first step on a long and complicated journey.
A journey that requires...
What does it require?
Constant reflection action, a willingness to challenge the status quo.
God, it's not easy.
So how do we, like, in 2024, actually build on Brown's legacy?
That's the question.
What does that look like?
Well, I think it starts with acknowledging the unfinished business of Brown.
Okay.
Confronting those racial disparities that still exist in education and housing and the economy.
Right.
And having honest conversations about how we got here.
Because we're still living with the consequences of that history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We can't just pretend it doesn't exist.
Right.
It's about fostering empathy, understanding, and a commitment to justice.
Okay.
Working together to create a society where everyone has a real shot at success.
Regardless of
their race or background.
It all sounds good in theory, but how do we actually make it happen?
Right. Where do we even start?
Yeah.
Well, I think a good place to start is by looking at Brown itself.
Okay.
Not just the legal ruling, but the movement that led to it.
Okay.
Think about the NAACP, the lawyers, the activists, the everyday people who risked everything to challenge segregation.
Right.
It was a collective effort, and that's what we need today.
So coalitions, collective action,
Exactly.
amplifying marginalized voices.
Yeah.
It's about more than just individual good intentions.
It is. It's about building power, holding institutions accountable, and pushing for systemic change.
That sounds like a pretty massive undertaking.
It is massive.
It can feel kind of overwhelming.
It can be, but Brown showed us what's possible when people come together and demand justice.
Okay.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Mm-hmm.
There will be setbacks, but we can't afford to be complacent.
We've got Brown as this historical marker,
Right.
but it's also a challenge.
Right? Absolutely.
Like a call to action. What's the one big takeaway from this part of our deep dive?
For me, it's the reminder that progress isn't always linear. We can celebrate Brown's achievements while also recognizing that the fight for racial justice is ongoing.
Yeah.
And it takes more than just legal victories.
Right.
It requires a fundamental shift in how we think, how we act, and how we structure our society.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap up this part of our conversation.
Yeah.
We've explored, the ripples of Brown, how it touched so many parts of American life, and how its legacy continues to challenge us today.
It's really powerful.
But before we get into solutions and next steps,
Okay.
I think it's important to take a moment and really grasp the different ways historians view Brown itself.
Oh, that's a great point.
Because those interpretations,
Right.
they inform how we understand its impact even today.
Absolutely. We need to understand how historians have grappled with Brown's complexity to really appreciate its nuances and its significance.
So are you ready to dive into the world of historiography?
Let's do it. I'm ready.
All right, so we're back and ready to tackle, how historians actually view Brown.
Yeah, it's like we've been talking about the case itself, but
Right.
now we need to talk about how people think about the case.
Yeah, like how they interpret it.
Exactly, because that shapes how we see it today.
So walk me through these different lenses.
Okay, so you've got the legalists,
Okay.
people like Richard Kluger,
Yeah.
who focus on the legal brilliance of the case
Okay.
and its impact on the American legal system.
We're like, wow, look at this legal strategy.
Exactly. They see it as a turning point, a triumph, like a testament to the power of the courts to drive change.
So for them, it's all about the precedent that Brown set.
Yeah, it's like Brown opened the door for future civil rights litigation.
Okay, so that's one view, but then you have...
You have the revisionists, like Michael J. Klarman,
Right, we've talked about it.
who are a bit more critical.
Yeah.
They acknowledge the importance of Brown symbolically, but they argue that its practical impact was limited.
Right, because of the resistance.
Exactly, because of all that resistance we talked about.
Yeah.
They point to the slow pace of desegregation,
Right.
the persistent inequalities, and the fact that many of those problems are still here today.
So it's a more nuanced take, maybe even a bit pessimistic?
Yeah, I mean, they're not saying Brown wasn't important,
Right.
but they're saying it wasn't a cure-all.
It's more complicated.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the legal view, the more critical view.
Then you have the traditionalists,
Okay.
like C. Van Woodward, who really dig into the depth of Southern resistance.
Okay.
They emphasize how ingrained white supremacy was in the South
Yeah.
and the lengths people went to preserve segregation.
So they're really looking at the context.
Exactly. The forces that Brown was up against.
Yeah.
They're saying, look, Brown exposed the limits of legal change
Right.
when you're facing such deeply held beliefs.
So we've got these three views, but are we missing something?
Well, you're thinking about the people, right?
Yeah, like what about the everyday people who actually made Brown happen?
Well, you got it. That's where the social historians come in.
Okay.
People like Charles M. Payne.
Mm-hmm.
They shift the focus to the grassroots activism.
So the community organizers?
Yeah, the people on the ground fighting for change.
In their schools and their neighborhoods?
Exactly. They took Brown and ran with it.
They didn't wait for someone to tell them what to do.
Nope. They organized, they protested, they pushed for change locally.
So for them, Brown's not just a legal decision.
Right. It's a catalyst for a movement.
Yeah, like the spark that ignites the fire.
Exactly. And they argue that without those activists, Brown might have just stayed a symbolic victory.
Wow, so we've got all these different ways of looking at the same event.
It's fascinating.
And each one adds a layer of understanding.
Yeah, it makes you realize how complex history really is.
It really does. Okay, so it's 2024 now. Why should we still care about this case?
That's the big question, right?
What can we learn from it?
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons is that progress isn't always simple.
Right. It's not a straight line.
Exactly. And there's no easy fix for these kinds of social problems.
It's like that saying about the arc of the moral universe.
Oh, yeah. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
But it doesn't bend on its own right.
Right. It takes work. It takes struggle.
People pushing it in the right direction.
Exactly. And Brown reminds us that legal victories are important.
Yeah.
But they're only one part of the picture.
We have to address the deeper issues.
Yeah, those systemic inequalities we talked about, housing, wealth opportunity.
And that takes more than just laws.
It does. It takes effort, collective action, a willingness to challenge the way things are.
To get uncomfortable.
Yeah, to keep learning and growing.
So Brown is like a call to action.
Is.
A reminder that the fight for a more just and equitable society is never really over.
Never over.
And that we all have a role to play in it.
Absolutely. Whether we're educators, activists, policymakers, or just everyday citizens, we can all do our part.
So Brown v. Board It, a landmark case, a complicated legacy, and a challenge to keep pushing.
To keep learning.
To keep fighting for a better future.
And maybe decades from now, people will look back at us and see that we were part of that arc bending toward justice.
I like that that's a hopeful note to end on.
It is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Brown v. Board of Education.
It was my pleasure.
We've covered a lot, but this is a conversation that continues.
Definitely.
We keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.